In life, we all encounter obstacles, and those obstacles come in all different shapes, sizes, and forms. The question is, how do we handle those obstacles? Do we attack them head on, or do we allow them to make us quit? Welcome to the No Quit Living podcast, where we aim to motivate and inspire listeners to never give up on themselves, their dreams, or their goals. We will interview successful people from all walks of life as they share their no-quit stories when they had the choice to give up or give in, but they didn't. We thank you for listening, and we hope to be that jolt of positivity as you go for your greatness. Welcome to episode number 202 of the No Quit Living podcast. I'm your host, Christopher J. Worth, and today's theme of the day is asking for help. Our quote of the day comes to us from Ken Petty. Sometimes it takes more courage to ask for help than to act alone. Today's episode is sponsored by the good people over at West Fair Communications, who publish the Westchester County Business Journal and the Fairfield County Business Journal. These newspapers do a wonderful job in covering all aspects of the business world within two of the most influential markets in the New York metropolitan area. You can also take advantage of their daily news feeds, which keep track on the companies and thought leaders in these important regions. For more information, take a look at www.westfaironline.com. Trust me, once you start reading, you won't quit. For those of you that might be familiar with the story of former NFL football player Pat Tillman and his career change into the military after 9/11, I think you will find today's episode very interesting. As we have touched upon vulnerability over the last few episodes, I think you'll appreciate and respect what Stephen Elliott brings with both his rawness and honesty. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Stephen, I'd like to welcome you to the No Quit Living podcast.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate it. So the first question I ask everybody is, are you ready to bring it today?
Well, depending on what it is, the answer is yes. I'll do my best. So.
That's kind of oxymoron. Depending upon what it is, it could be something really bad.
It could. Whatever it is, it will be what it is. So yeah.
Awesome. So when we spoke the other day, you shared your story with me, and you have an incredible no-quit story, which has led you to where you are today. And I wanted to just ask if you wouldn't mind sharing that with our listeners.
Yeah, for sure. So, kind of the Reader's Digest version is back in 2003, as I was finishing my undergraduate degree, I joined the Army in large part in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and then found my way eventually, after all of my training and selection, at 2nd Ranger Battalion at Fort Lewis, Washington. And that was in the end of 2003. And I was assigned to a platoon at 2nd Ranger Battalion in which there were two brothers, Pat and Kevin Tillman. And Pat, of course, has gained some level of notoriety as he elected to give up an NFL contract in favor of military service. And so I worked with Pat and Kevin as we trained to go to war. And in April of 2004, 15 years ago, right now, 15 years ago, I was in Afghanistan, and we were conducting combat operations as Rangers on the Afghan-Pakistan border. And on April 22nd of 2004, our platoon was ambushed. And as the smoke cleared and we took stock of casualties and what had occurred, it was evident that we had sustained 4 casualties. And it was also evident that all of those casualties were sustained as a result of friendly fire, in which one part of our platoon mistakenly fired on another part of the platoon, believing them to be the enemy. And there's a variety of other circumstances that surrounded that. One of those killed that day was Pat. And as we came to kind of put the pieces together, it became clear that we don't know to this day who is responsible for Pat's death. But we know that there's likely 2 Rangers in that platoon who are likely responsible for his death, and I am one of those 2 men. And so that truth, once the shock wore off, landed pretty hard and put me on a very different path than the one I thought I had signed up for.
I appreciate your candor, and I think it's incredible what you've done with it and how you share. And I know that where you are today, you've been doing a lot of work, and we had an amazing conversation the other day. I guess that may be an interesting question, but what is it from the moment you found out that horrible news until today that you've done in regards to staying positive and keep moving on. And I know that you obviously have their challenging days, I assume. But I guess the question is also like, what type of things were you reading or watching, and what kept you, I guess, going in those tough times?
Yeah, that's a good question. The biggest thing for me, I mean, I went through a period of years. I mean, where I wasn't. I'd like to say that I stuck to my John Maxwell books and I read my Bible, and I did all of the right things. For a lot of years, I didn't. I hated the Army. I was guilt ridden and shame ridden, and I did everything I could to put more accomplishments between myself and my military service. And I continued. I mean, that happened at that point in my enlistment. I hadn't even been in the Army for a year at that point. And so, I left the Rangers and I continued and finished my 4-year commitment. And effectively, I doubled down for a lot of years. I doubled down on accomplishment, achievement, and I need to essentially, even though I never thought this, I never sat down and wrote this out as a plan, but in retrospect, that's kind of how I was operating. It was, there's this awful thing that I was a part of, and I need to somehow have enough quote unquote good or positive things on the other side of the ledger to outweigh that. And while it's good to keep going, it's good to I left the Army and I became a wealth manager with a large wealth management firm. I experienced success there, and I was very blessed in a lot of respects. I was too afraid to actually stare my own failure and my own pain in the face, and so it wasn't until, all that to say is that when you're pursuing things that are positive, that's fine. Unless you're pursuing those things because you're running from something. That thing you're running from, it will always catch up with you. And for me, I'm convinced that I put myself through a lot more pain and anguish because I was too afraid to get help. I was too afraid to raise my hand and say, I'm not doing particularly well. I'm medicating with alcohol in ways that are not healthy. Still very high functioning, white collar professional. But the ramifications of that, continued to deteriorate friendships, marriage, all sorts of things. And so it was ultimately after, 12 years of that, when you're kind of staring at the consequences of those choices that are surrounded by achievement and other good things, that for me, to answer your question, what really made the difference was I had to hit bottom and recognize that I was not, as a human, I was not made to live life as an independent free agent, that I was made, as we all are, for community, and that I was only going to experience health and healing when I was willing to lay down my pride and my ego and seek help within that community, share my own story of shame, and recognize that I'm probably not alone. That's the funny thing about shame. Oftentimes, is it can actually be an odd expression of pride, because we come to believe that somehow what we've done or haven't done is so uniquely special or horrible. Which maybe it is. It's not to it's not to soft pedal our failures, but it's to say that if you think you're alone and nobody else could understand what you've done or what you've experienced, you're probably kidding yourself. You're not that special. So there's a lot of people who've been to war. There's a lot of people who've experienced trauma. There's a lot of people who've hurt people intentionally and unintentionally, and so that was the again, in very quick summary, that was the key difference for me, is I had to get to a point where I kind of embraced this idea, and it's an idea that a very dear friend of mine is fond of quoting. It's a South African proverb, I believe, and it translates into English as "I am because we are." And it's this idea that as an individual, I can only be the individual I was made to be when I am thriving in healthy community. And that community can only be what it was made to be when it's comprised of healthy, thriving individuals. It's a feedback loop. It's not one or the other. And that's something that I had to learn the hard way, and I continue to learn because I continue to have our culture. I think tends to reward the rugged individualist far more than it does the submitted collective. And in reality, those two things are not polar opposites. They're parts of the same whole. And so for me, I can't, beyond, scripture. I'm a follower of Jesus. Beyond that, I can't point to, books or ideas, because I was my own worst enemy. And I just had to get to the point to where I was tired enough and sick enough of the ramifications of my choices that I raised my hand and I said, I need help and I need other people to help me.
I truly appreciate your openness and willingness to share that. And I believe the South African proverb it's Ubuntu, I believe you were referencing. That's awesome. I had a guest, a gentleman by the name of Shola Richards, who wrote an amazing book called Go Together, and he references Ubuntu quite a few times, and I think it's really powerful. But I want to just go back for a minute and just say the two very powerful words to you, thank you. And the reason I say thank you is for not only sharing what you shared, but the realist approach in the sense that you know that you needed help, but it's not until you hit bottom. But not even that, it's you have to ask for help. And I think I've had the incredible opportunity to interview some amazing people and listen to their no-quit stories, but I can't do something for you. I can't do something for somebody else. Now you can offer and you can be helpful, but the reality is it doesn't matter what I'm willing to do unless you yourself are at the point where you're willing and able to accept that help. And I think the fact that you asked for help is incredible, because I think so many people don't ask for the help and they continue to go about it themselves and self-medicate in different things, whether it's books, drugs, alcohol, sex, you name it, working too much,
Yep.
at the expense of their family, friends, what have you. But I'm so grateful that you shared that. And a couple of the last episodes, we've been talking about the concept of vulnerability, and I think being vulnerable is actually empowering. So I think you asking and needing help is where you are today, and I think it's amazing. But want to just switch lanes for a minute and just ask you if you wouldn't mind just telling our listeners a little bit about what you're working on today and kind of what you're doing today.
Yeah. So I've written down my experiences in terms of my military service, leading up to, during, and following my time in Afghanistan, in a book called War Story that will be released to the public on May 21st, just here in about a month. And that story is really meant to be put in service for catalyzing change within how the active duty military component views and treats the unseen wounds of war. My story is representative of so many other stories. I think I say it in the introduction of the book, is that if the story that I experienced and that I was in is worth reading, it's not worth reading because it is unique, but it's worth reading precisely because it's ordinary, because it's one of many, many stories of people approaching something with idealism, of meeting the reality of their failure and others' failures, and then trying to pick up the pieces as a result. And so we're seeking to put that story that's going to be in book form in service of advocating for very real, tangible policy reforms at the active duty level within our military. There's so many facets of our government and our system that can be improved, and we have to continuously be improving and growing. And there's a lot of focus on the Veterans Administration, Veterans Affairs Administration, the VA, and rightly so. But we believe that one thing that we know is that one thing that every veteran has in common with each other is that they were all at one point on active duty. And that may seem rather obvious, but it means that any wounds that they incurred that would even bring them to the VA, those wounds were incurred while on active duty. And oftentimes there is a big gap of understanding between and cultural gaps in terms of how those wounds can be recognized and treated without the individual effectively having to self-select themselves to not be part of the unit or be stigmatized or not even know how. I mean, I had raging PTSD for years, and I didn't even know what it stood for. And so by the time I was at a place when I'm staring at divorce and staring at other things, years after I had even deployed, it was the equivalent of, having a gunshot wound, and the first time you're pulling off the bandages are, 5 or 6 years after the fact. At that point, that wound is going to have metastasized, and there's going to be other issues that will be laid on top of the initial wound in the first place. And so our hope is that, by putting the story in service of that movement, that we can help provide and advocate for improvements in the systems so that those wounds, to the extent that they exist, are treated and recognized as close to the point of trauma as possible, because we feel that's where, in anything, that's where we can have the most effect. So yeah, that's what we're up to now. War Story, as I said, will be out on May 21st. And then we're using all of the financial proceeds that I would otherwise receive as the author are going to be directed to an organization called the Elliott Fund. And that fund will be passing on those proceeds to other organizations doing good work in improving mental health for our veteran and active duty community. And elliottfund.org, 2 L's, 2 T's, is the website where folks can go to learn more about the issue in general, as far as kind of the research that we're standing on and the folks that we've partnered with that have helped us flesh out some recommendations. And also, that's where, if they're interested, they can go and actually lend their voice by signing a petition. We're going to be presenting our recommendations to the Secretary of Defense and the chairmen of the Armed Services and House Armed Services committees. And so if folks want to learn more, we'd encourage them to go to elliottfund.org, and they can read more about what we're up to. And if they see fit, certainly lend their voice in support of the cause.
When we spoke earlier this week in our pre-interview phone call, I think typically the phone calls last anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. I think we spoke for upwards of an hour. But what I love about your story, meaning not just your story, but your book, is you talked, and one of the first things you said is it's a story for catalyzing change. And then the other thing, which was really interesting, is you talked about, with the government, with the military, is making these changes, but doing it together and working together. And I think that's the best thing, because to me, that's what collaboration is. It's not my idea is better and you're doing a bad job, or you're not doing a good enough job, so we're going to replace you. That's where our country is today. It's everything's fighting. It's everything is hatred. It's you're not good, I'm better. And what you spoke about is, again, going back to working together and you're advocating positive improvements and changes, and you're doing it because you were there and you went through an incredibly difficult situation. In no way, shape, or form can I ever tell you that I know what you went through, but the reality is we all go through different things, and we have to be willing to heal. But the other thing that I think is amazing is the proceeds from your book are going to help others, and something that you and I spoke about on our pre-interview call is what I talk about almost every single day with our company, with our podcast, is going ahead and taking action. So I commend you for doing that, and I definitely would recommend our listeners not only to get a copy of your book or a download or audio book, but also to check out that fund, because I think it's amazing, as I said, is paying it forward and making some positive changes for things that you feel are needed. And again, you've been there, you've dealt it. So I want to change lanes for a minute here and ask you a question that maybe you have been asked before, but if you had to define yourself, but you could only use one word, what would that word be?
Oh, geez.
That's two words. Oh, geez.
That's 2 words? You count ums and I think curious. If my wife, this interview would be far more interesting if my wife were here and you asked her that. Curious. I think it has changed. I think if you would have asked me that question when I was 22, which I'm so grateful that the internet was not much of a thing, because who knows what sort of stupid ideas of mine could have been recorded and kept for posterity as a younger man. I think earlier I would have maybe said or thought of myself. I probably would have. If I was answering that question truthfully when I was 20, I probably would have said confident. But I probably would have had enough emotional IQ to not actually say that, because that doesn't sound very good. And I think I still have so much to learn. I'm learning every day, and the more I learn, the more I realize that I don't know very much. And so I think I'm becoming, through a lot of my own kind of self-inflicted pride, ego, stubbornness, I'm just becoming more curious. I'm learning that as I step into issues. I mean, this issue is a great one. In some respects, I have a lot to offer because, I was in the Army, I was in Afghanistan, I was a Ranger, et cetera, and I have that my experiences. In other respects, I have very little to offer because I have no perspective. And so, I'm not a clinician, I'm not a mental health professional. I don't know all the ins and outs of how the system works, but I have my experiences. And so I think I'm just becoming more and more curious, more and more aware of how little information I often am operating on. And that's okay. But then just becoming really curious about the perspectives of others and how, given a particular issue, each perspective, each voice, each story is kind of its own facet that refracts the light a little bit differently and helps you see things a little bit more clearly. So I like to think that I'm becoming more curious than confident as I would have been younger in life.
No, I think that's part of growing up and maturing. So kudos to you. You're becoming an adult in
Thank you.
Today's day and age. But one of the things we often touch on, and maybe your military background might be interesting, but is the morning routine. And I was curious if you have either a morning routine or a daily routine that you swear by.
Yeah, I don't follow it as probably often as I should, but for me, the most important decision of the day is just getting out of bed. I've learned a couple real practical things. Is I don't have technology in the bedroom. I'll find myself, scrolling on LinkedIn or just wasting time on something or other on my phone or laptop when I should be reading a book and kind of winding down. So in the morning that helps because I can't lay in bed and have this like window to the rest of the world that then I waste the first half an hour of my day, looking at work emails or doing something like that. So for me, I try and keep technology out of the bedroom. My eyes pop open. I'm awake. I like to, at the very least, try and take a walk in the mornings and kind of physically just get the body going and eat. I sound like my grandmother. I eat a good breakfast. So I've learned that I got to have a good high protein breakfast, and when I do that, it just really sets the stage for the rest of the day. So those are the main things for me. It's just really kind of managing my own physical being and then I try and either in the car or I try and read some scripture every morning to sort of get perspective on why I'm even doing what I'm doing, because I think it's so easy to just jump right into the task list for the day. I'm a very task oriented person. I like my checklists, and so my best days are the ones in which I create a healthy amount of space before I kind of jump in the race car and start on the track.
No, I definitely think that's some great advice. And no technology, whether it's in the bedroom, whether it's the first half hour or an hour, is something that has been so common throughout the last year. And I think it's something that, although we rely on technology way too much, I think the other component is we waste time on technology way too much. I'm glad you touched on that. And wanted to ask you if there's anything that you're reading currently or anything you've read recently that you'd like to possibly recommend to our listeners.
I just read a book that was recommended to me by a friend of mine called "Completing Capitalism," and it was written by two economists from the Mars Corporation, candy and gum people, and they basically got the approval to essentially write this book because it was originally just a research project for their senior management. But they proffered a very interesting idea, and the idea is, the idea of capitalism versus socialism, collectivism versus individualism. Those ideas are, I think, probably more sensitive now than they have been since the Gilded Age. Their thesis was essentially that our error has been in focusing too much on one form of capital, which is money, that is a transmission mechanism. And it's a transmission mechanism for other forms of capital, which are human capital, actual people, and the earth in which we live and that we're charged to steward. And so they lay out their thesis in a really interesting fashion, and then they actually share case studies that they've tried in terms of measuring not just financial capital, which is pretty easy to measure. And we figured out, how to measure the value of options, and we figured out all sorts of financial statements with which we can measure financial capital. But in doing so, that seems to be the only thing that we're managing to. And so then the idea of how that accumulation of financial capital affects the earth, how it affects the people that are actually helping to accumulate that capital, we kind of shrug our shoulders and say, well, that's kind of hard. We don't know how to do it. Well, 50 years ago, we didn't know how to value a bond, but now we do. And so it was just really enlivening and interesting. I'm not necessarily saying that that's the end all be all for how we think about the idea of our economic system, but whether you're an economist or in the wealth management world or not, I think just as a citizen of the planet, it's a fascinating thing to think about. How do we take steps forward in stewarding that which we have, the money we have, the relationships we have, and the earth in which we all share. And so it's a short read for economists. They're pretty conversational, so you don't have to have a PhD in economics to appreciate it. And that's been something I've really been chewing on over the last few weeks.
Is that a new book?
I think it's within the last couple of years, but yeah, it's Completing Capitalism, and I think the subtitle is "Heal Business to Heal the World," and so it's within the last few years that it was published.
No, I appreciate that. I've not heard that, so it's one of the questions I love asking, because we get all different, or I get all different recommendations as well, and as my listeners do. If I could magically go back to the 20-year-old version of yourself, and you could give yourself one piece of advice, what would you have liked to have told the 20-year-old version of yourself?
Shut up and just listen. Just stop and listen, because it's not new information, but when your mouth is moving, your ears aren't working. And so I think just quiet yourself, listen, watch, observe, and use that time far more for observation and teachability, as opposed to formulating your action plan for life. And so, I think I would have probably, that's what I would like to tell the 20-year-old version of myself, very kindly, but very directly, because I think that would have saved me some angst. No, that's good advice. And I think what is it, the saying that you have, one mouth and two ears for a reason? That's right. That's exactly right. So if I could give you the opportunity to have dinner with anybody, dead or alive, who would you choose and why? Wow, that's a really good question. I think, gosh, I don't know. I just got done watching a great documentary on the Roosevelts. I think I'd love to talk to FDR and just talk to that man who saw and experienced so much in a position of leadership in such tumultuous times in our country. I think, he's somebody who's, just because that's fresh on my mind, pretty fascinating, and just even the personal ties, because my grandparents, obviously I'm from Central Kansas. They lived through the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, and so thinking about my family and how that related to the times they were in, both in the Great Depression and World War II. My grandfather was a veteran of World War II, and he was Republican. He never voted for FDR, but he had tremendous respect for him and just his leadership. It's just so fascinating to think about. I think maybe it's more poignant today because our country feels so divided, to look back at that time and see the horror of the economic horror of the Great Depression, and certainly the horror of World War II, and also just to see the unity and the leadership that he exhibited in the midst of that crisis. I think again, I'm curious, and I'd like to listen just to hear more of what he would have to say. It'd probably be a very, very interesting dinner. Something that we often touch on, and we love the word accountability. And I'm curious, from both your professional but also your military background, what does the word accountability mean to you? It means mutual submission. It means that in whatever context, whether you're the CEO of the organization or whether you're the mail clerk, whether you're a husband or a wife, whether you're a parent, your job, you never cease to need accountability, and that's for your own good. That I think we are made to live life in submission to one another. That if I'm in a position of leadership in any capacity in the home or in the workplace, that means it's my job to use my skills, my talents, my time and resources to serve the people in our organization and outside of our organization. And that anytime I'm shunning healthy accountability, I should probably go stop and take a walk and rethink my heart in that moment, because that's probably not a good place to be. So that's the first thing I think of when I hear that word.
That's a great definition, and I think I like how you touched on it from CEO to mail clerk, and then you went through some other analogies. I think that's spot on. And when you and I were doing our pre-interview call a couple of days ago, we talked about lack of leadership in different areas in our country. And I was curious, maybe a difficult question, but if you could offer one suggestion to our country, let's call it, in regards to leadership, what do you think would make sense as far as improving the leadership status where we currently are?
I mean, I think we somehow have to move, and this is true in the world of business. This is certainly true in the world of politics. It's true in every respects. Our collective attention spans have just become shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. And the idea of planting the flag, metaphorically, and looking out beyond the next quarterly earnings call, or looking out beyond the next election, or looking out beyond the next stimulus, not economic stimulus, but the next feedback that I'm going to get from my behavior, seems to be getting harder and harder, and it becomes more and more necessary. And so I don't know how we would do that practically from a tactical standpoint, but strategically, we have to be able to step back and look out and say, these are steps we're taking today, this year, this quarter, et cetera, because this is where we're trying to go over the next decade or the next 20 years. And it seems that is, I mean, if it's a tweet from yesterday, it might as well, be, a codex from an Egyptian tomb. I mean, it's practically, it's outdated. And I think we have to have a way of looking back and realizing that we're humans and we're repeating the same mistakes of the past, and we're not above that just because we have technology in our hip pocket. That there's a lot we can learn from by looking back, a long ways even, and that if we're going to move forward, we have to move forward by looking further than just the next step. And I don't know how we do that necessarily, but I feel like that's something that has to happen.
No, I think that's great advice, and I think you touched on quite a few perspectives that I think we all need to think about in regards to how we look at things, not only today, but like you said, down the road and just past the next earnings announcement or the past election. And I think that, what does they say, that the history is the best predictor of what's to come as far as potential things. And I think you want to look at and experience people that have been there and done that, so you don't try to recreate the wheel. So I think that's some good advice. Wanted to jump over to what we call our hot seat questions. And the only request we have of you is that you spit out the first thing that comes to mind.
Oh, geez. All right.
Favorite sport?
Soccer.
Favorite team?
Seattle Sounders.
Favorite smell?
Leather.
All-time favorite movie?
North by Northwest.
Favorite quote?
Don't let your schooling get in the way of your education.
Who's that by?
Mark Twain.
Favorite book?
Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton.
Favorite group or band?
Right now, if my wife and daughter were here, they would roll their eyes and they could answer for you. But right now it is the Avett Brothers. Okay.
And then interesting question, because you're the first person we've asked this to in your prior world, so you'll understand is why it's interesting, is if you were trapped in a foxhole and you could only choose one person to have your back, who would it be and why?
It would be my wife, because she is, she's honest, and I know that whatever she tells me is the unvarnished truth, whether I like to hear it or not.
That's good. And because you answered that way, you'll probably earn some points as well.
Right.
Make sure she tunes in at the 32-minute mark of the interview. Just tell her that's the only.
Exactly. Like, start there. That's where the interview.
And then wanted to ask you, what's the best way for our listeners to follow you, find out more about your book, or also the fund, and if they just want to connect with you in general?
Yeah, actually, right now it is elliottfund.org. They can contact us through that site. They can see media appearances that are continuing to occur as the book launches, and they can. Right now, we're using that as our prime platform for communication to the public about what we're doing. So yeah, elliottfund.org, 2 L's, 2 T's.
Awesome. And then your book comes out May 21st, correct?
May 21st. It's available for pre-sale, Amazon and wherever you get fine nonfiction. It's out.
Awesome. And then last question I wanted to ask you is if you have any parting words you'd like to leave with our listeners.
I would just encourage anybody listening that you're not alone, and your individual effort is absolutely essential. We're all individual free agents, and we get to wake up every day and choose how we spend our time. And we all have the same time. We all have 24/7. Nobody has more or less. But don't ever think that you will be able to thrive without community. And so I would, if to the extent that you're suffering for that or looking for that, or maybe don't believe that, I would encourage you to find that for yourself, because that will be essential for you becoming the individual that you want to be and need to be in the days to come.
Well, I could not end that on a better note, and I truly, truly appreciate not only what you shared with us, but also your time. And I recommend and hope that our listeners will not only connect with you, but also get a copy of your book when it comes out.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you for listening to episode number 202. Whether or not you are a fan of Pat Tillman as an NFL player, it will be very difficult not to respect his decision to fight for our country. On today's episode, Stephen was very open and vulnerable when it came to his story. Even though he has had a successful post-military career in the financial world, Stephen was dealing with a lot. According to his own words, he was his own worst enemy, and it wasn't until he hit rock bottom that he finally decided to ask for help. Today, Stephen is taking action and hoping to have a positive impact. With a new book coming out, His Foundation, and hopes of working with both the government and military, Stephen is being vulnerable and bold through his positive action. In his parting words, Stephen touched upon some very key points. He mentioned how we all have the same 24 hours in each day, how we are not alone, and how we all need community. So my challenge to our listeners today is very simple. Be bold, be strong, be vulnerable, but ask for help. I know it sounds easy, but nobody should have to deal with their challenges alone. As Stephen so eloquently said, it's perfectly okay to ask for help, but in return, make sure that you are there for others as well. It goes both ways. As we continue with our Pay It Forward with Positivity movement, and as you go for your greatness today, remember to be kind. Be kind to others, but also be kind to yourself as well. And lastly, to our listeners, thank you. We truly appreciate your time, and we hope our episodes inspire you to keep on attacking life and never giving up. To quote Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, it's always too early to quit.